All right, welcome back. So let's take a look at the art of this time period. So there are a bunch of different names, and you'll see them in the textbook as well, that I want to specifically mention here. And hopefully you guys are going over the textbook as well, because looking at the textbook and the lectures is useful to remembering things in time for the quiz. But um, let's start off with this one, which I made sort of the image for this week. And this is, no, sorry, actually it's the next one that I did that. But they're very similar paintings. So painting had a long history. Greeks and Romans would paint, and then it kind of, the painting styles got a lot simpler. And then in the Renaissance, it kind of picked back up again in terms of the level of detail that people were interested in achieving. We look at a painting like this and think it looks almost like a photograph. It's very much trying to be realistic. And to think that you can achieve all this with paint, like I can barely, paint with like watercolors. For someone to be able to get something like these complicated patterns of light and shadow is very impressive. And the Enlightenment was a time period where these techniques really developed further and further. Part of this was because people were understanding how light worked in more detail. They studied, how does light move? How does it refract through prisms? How does it reflect off of things? Sir Isaac Newton did a lot of studying of that. They studied how do colors work. Sir Isaac Newton, in fact, studied some of that as well. He said, the colors are basically the waves of light. And so how do they mingle and how do they blur? And principles were worked out for that. So all this knowledge really helped people investigate things and develop ways of depicting reality accurately in their paintings. And also, because of all this interest in light, we find that a lot of paintings from this time period really have a lot of use of light and shadow, as we can see in these paintings here. So these are a couple paintings by a fellow named Vermeer. Vermeer was a Dutch painter, and here we see a geographer looking over his map, using his compass to measure, a route that someone might take on a ship, or measure the distance between 2 points on this map, or maybe even drawing the map out for the first time based on careful observations. So the great thing is that this is, pointing the way to what were people really interested in this time period. They were interested in things like geography and measurement and stuff like that. So the fact that this is a subject of the painting, as well as the painting having benefited from all this knowledge. Another famous one by Vermeer is The Astronomer. And this is the one that I put up for today's, or this week's content image. And I think this might be a woman being depicted here. There were definitely women who were educated and who were taking an interest in all of this stuff. But the astronomer she is looking at sort of a star globe. In this previous one, we had like an earthly globe, and here we have a globe of the stars and the constellations that are on it. Again, with that sort of careful measurement of the heavens. This is the mood during this time period. And I think you can tell, based on the images here, that Vermeer is like working with the same sort of sets of furniture and things like that. But Vermeer also painted some other things. For instance, this one is a woman holding a balance. That is a scale that would be used to measure the weight or something. Usually this was for some economic reason, like measuring like the amount of food you were getting or measuring the gold or something like that. But here it's kind of interesting because it might be a metaphor for religion. Jesus is measuring, or God is measuring your sort of sins versus your good virtues. And in the background is a painting, another painting of God doing the last judgment and passing judgment on people. So it shows that God was still very much a concern. But yeah, in general, Vermeer seems to have been very interested in ordinary life as well. These scenes were painted using sort of ordinary furniture and day-to-day stuff. And that's a theme that's going to hold through all of Enlightenment painting. Previously in Renaissance painting, people really got into like depicting the gods and the goddesses from Greek mythology, and even like ancient leaders and heroes from Greek mythology, or Greek history. Or Roman history. But now we don't see any of that. And it seems like the mood has shifted. The mood has shifted away from like, look how great the Greeks are, to look how great people are. There's a real interest in this time period in people, and the philosophers, they all seem to have the goal of improving people's lives. That's a big sort of preoccupation with them, is how do we improve people's lives? And so to think that people are important, you know, ordinary people, and we care about them. Um, Another image that shows this is a very famous one by Vermeer. You may have seen this, is Girl with a Pearl Earring. So the girl has kind of her hair up in an odd and interesting sort of wrap here of yellow and blue, and she has this pearl earring, and she has this sort of beautiful, attractive face, and this almost sort of attracted facial expression. It's been a very famous portrait, and you know, she's just a person that Vermeer could have met on the street, or maybe somebody that he knew. There's debate over who it might have been. But you know, he's not trying to turn her into the Greek goddess Athena. He's trying to say, you know, who is she? Let's, you know, take her picture effectively. Let's make a portrait of her. And you might think that if Vermeer's thinking about the, you know, the technique of painting, and he's thinking about sort of ordinary life, and he's thinking about uh, how to depict things in rich detail with light and darkness, then isn't he going to paint himself at some point? And here we are exactly. Well, he paints a painter. So he shows a painter at work, and he shows a woman in the background. And this might be a self-portrait. This is the time period where we see self-portraits. But in this painting, he is just painting the woman here. You can see the top of her hat. So this is Vermeer getting meta and talking about painting by painting a painting of himself painting. There are other artists who did that too. There's another one in the book that you can check out as well, where the artist is painting herself, painting a painting. And I should mention there were women artists in this time period. One of them was Van Oosterwijk. A lot of these painters were Dutch, actually. There was a big Dutch painting scene during the Enlightenment. So this is what's called a still life. Basically, you paint a bunch of objects, maybe some flowers, maybe some stuff you've got around the house, in a collection there, instead of trying to paint a person. And this is interesting because, again, it's that focus on ordinary life and like capturing the details and how do you make things look really realistic. These artists are kind of challenging themselves to do that. But the fun thing is that someone like Maria Oosterwijk can put lots of interesting symbolic stuff in there too, like the constellations and like a skull, which usually represents death, and the hourglass is running out. So you've got flowers for life, and then these symbols of time running out and death. Sort of the mix of human existence. So that's what's being depicted here, and not just some random stuff. And a lot of these sort of female artists like Maria, a lot of the time they were helping male artists and didn't get as much credit as they deserved for working on these projects or being their assistants. But some of them, like Oosterwijk, could break out on their own. Another one who did still lifes was Rachel Ruisk. I'm not good at Dutch pronunciations, but here is a very beautiful and a little softer, a little more sort of pastel-y piece of art that shows a vase of flowers with all this sort of rich detail, maybe even more detail than you would have actually seen in real life. But yeah, to continue with these themes here, the theme of ordinary life seems to be very important. Peter de Hooch it depicted this image of an interior with a mother delousing her child. So she's getting lice out of her child's hair. You know, maybe you had that experience in like elementary school, having lice in your hair. And this is a very, very ordinary thing. And this is a very ordinary house, you know. We're moving away from the upper classes who are all fancy to something like this. Another one of his is Card Players in a Sunlit Room. And this is one of the ones where we really see that emphasis on light and shadow. Look at this. They know exactly where the light is coming from through the window and through the door, because people in this time period have been studying how light moves around. So they've really figured that out. And this is the kind of techniques that they teach artists today. And look how dark the shadowy side is of them. Here's another ordinary scene by a guy called Ter Borch. And yeah, always double checking my pronunciations there. This is the suitor's visit. This is someone's boyfriend becoming, or gentleman caller, coming to pick her up in this family. Meanwhile, you've got someone else kind of leaning over the table and playing a musical instrument. So there's an emphasis on music, and there's an emphasis on sort of, the way things would look in ordinary life. There's a little dog here. This is just an ordinary family, maybe an upper class family, but, pretty recognizable for the time period. And so it's cool. We've moved away from the realm of the gods into this ordinary life. Franz Hals has a few that are really good. I mean, this one is almost like a photorealistic image right here, the Laughing Cavalier. You get his real sense of personality from this one, and like the details of his clothes are all there. Now, this was probably commissioned by this guy, but you really get a sense of, who he is and how detailed his clothes are, which would have probably made him very happy to see his ornate clothes being recognized. Another one by Halls is Buffoon Playing a Lute, which is maybe a little bit less flattering. But again, look at how much detail there is to the clothing. These artists learned from their teachers, and then those teachers learned from their previous teachers. And they're not just content to keep things as they are. They're really developing the technique here to make things look more and more naturalistic. Although there is some style to it with sort of the light and the shadow that you see here. Another famous Enlightenment painting is this one by Rembrandt. And Rembrandt is a really big deal in the world of Enlightenment painting. He is like the guy. He has a very almost sort of magical style to him. He makes everything look sort of misty almost. You can kind of see it here. The light is kind of spread out a bit more, and things are a little bit more blurred, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't know how to make things look very natural. This is a famous painting that has been called The Night Watch. I'm blanking on what its actual name is. It's sort of always remembered as the Night Watch, though. These are some people who are part of, I believe, a militia to defend their home city, sort of gathered and sort of raising their flags and getting their muskets ready and walking and talking. And, these are the clothes that people wore in ordinary life. Imagine, what it would be like if you had paintings that were this good, depicting just sort of random people that you knew or random people who were at your school. That would be pretty interesting, I think. Rembrandt is also known for the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. This is interesting because, again, we see science is the subject of the painting. And, this guy is taking a dead body, which was a bit of a frowned upon thing, actually, because it was sort of sacrilegious. And like, where are we getting these dead bodies from? Are we digging them out of the grave? Sometimes we are. But, showing this sort of morbid thing that is nonetheless very scientifically important. Dr. Tulp here is showing, how do muscles and bones and nerves work? And all these gentlemen who all look kind of similar, they've all got kind of the same style going on. They're all leaning over to get a good look and to see, how this all works. So if you want to think of sort of an image of this time period, it's a bunch of guys kind of leaning over a dead body to try and figure out how it all works. That's kind of the big idea during this time. Okay, and I apologize for not including a self-portrait of Rembrandt. He did quite a few. Actually, let me see. I'm going to try and pull one up here and show it on my internet tab here, because his self-portraits are very good as well, and very sort of characteristic of him. He painted a lot of them, and the idea of doing portraits of yourself is kind of a new thing in this time period. Why would you make a painting of yourself instead of making a painting of something incredible like the gods or the philosophers? Well, Rembrandt thought it was pretty cool to paint himself as well. Sorry, just a sec. We'll load it up here. Trying to find the one that I like the most. Okay, let's go here. So right now I have A bunch of self-portraits of Rembrandt actually are up on the screen right now. While it's loading, you can see them all. You have him as a young man, you have him as a much older man. Sometimes he's happy, sometimes he's frowning and looking serious. He really liked to paint his self-portraits. And I think it's fun that artists are doing this now because we get a much better sense of who they are. Whereas in previous time periods, people would mainly paint, kings or emperors or gods or, ancient philosophers. And so this one, he kind of, I don't know, he almost looks like he's giving us a silly look, like, it almost seems like he's on a sitcom or something. That's the kind of impression I get from his expression. And again, like a lot of these artists, he is Dutch, and he is part of the big Dutch painting scene. But I think this image is really cool because it really shows us how he understood light and shadow. He was confident enough to have there be a lot of darkness in the image and not feel like it would be washed out. And using almost sort of a loose pattern of light and dark to make something that seemed almost sort of ephemeral and magical. So that's Dutch Enlightenment era painting for you. And you can see how things are moving in some really interesting directions and more realistic directions. Although Rembrandt kind of reminds us that you can also have style points along the way. Okay, I think that is probably all I want to do in this video. In the next video, I want to finish off by talking a little bit more about the sort of political philosophers who are important. And then finally, we will talk about, we will talk about and listen to music. And music is pretty awesome. So looking forward to seeing you guys in that video.